Hi, I have with me Jonathan Grammer and from Grammer Land and Exploration and also CEO of US Carbon Capture. And we were just discussing Texas growth and what the drivers are and how it relates to energy. And now we're going to talk about enhanced oil recovery because in Texas, we're the largest oil and gas producer in the country. And it's a very relevant conversation because we're trying to extract more oil in place. We're trying to become more efficient with our resource use and all that. And so I'm going to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind, um, about enhanced oil recovery. And I know that you have a background, a lot of your practice as a landman has been surrounding the oil and gas industry. And so you have a lot of, inside knowledge about that. And I appreciate your time.
Sure.
So what are some of the basic types of enhanced oil recovery? And what are we talking about when we talk about that?
I have to, I would say that most people in the general population, and maybe even a larger percentage than I'd care to admit in the oil and gas industry itself, don't know a great deal about recovery rates, onshore oil and gas. That when you see a pump jack that's ceased working or you see one that's currently pumping, there's an assumption perhaps that at the end of its life, we will have through, artificial pressure, which is essentially what an oil well does, will have recovered all of the available oil underneath the ground. The truth is, or that it's existing in some free flowing form where it's in, a pool of oil, like in the old days that we see evidenced in the movies. But for the most part, a lot of this oil is trapped and it exists in singular molecules that have to be extracted through a whole host of different mechanisms. And one of those is primary production, which is essentially drilling of the wellbore and perforation of the wellbore. And either through water drive or gas drive, natural pressure, that oil flows to the surface. You can install a natural gas compressor. You can install a pump jack to extract it. But even when those methods have concluded, a vast majority of oil is left in place. We call it OOIP, original oil in place, and that number is extremely high.
Right.
Over the years of the industry, reservoir engineers have developed multiple ways to add additional pressure or to affect the viscosity of oil to stimulate additional production. We call it secondary and sometimes tertiary recovery. Secondary recovery can be water flows. If you inject water from a freshwater source, you can add pressure and push out additional oil that's trapped, sometimes in the capillary forces of veins that fracture underneath the ground. You can add methane, foam, microbials, different types of acid, and carbon dioxide to add pressure to help oil and gas to come out and to maximize volumes. Even after those recovery methods, so in Texas and in the lower 48, we still, after 150 years of innovation, leave an incredible amount of oil in place. And that's no more true than it is in tight sand shale formations.
Mm-hmm.
Even with horizontal drilling, there's a vast amount of recoverable oil that we leave at the end of the life of a well.
Right. Yeah, I had a conversation with an executive from a large shale producer, and he was saying that, we only extract like 6 to 8%, and that through enhanced oil recovery methods that, we could get 2 times that. And that was kind of like that, and that would be a big thing to have that. I mean, I guess I'm wondering of the methods, water floods, wet gas, or carbon capture, which one is one more efficient than the other?
Which works best?
I
Well,
guess
it's
it's
going
also
to,
about economics too, right?
well, you have a lot of variables, availability of your injection material. And do you
Right.
have, if you're going to do a water flood, Where's your water source? If you're going to inject CO2, and this is the big missing link in why industrial carbon dioxide has very rarely been utilized for EOR, is how close is your emission source? How pure is it? And how close is it to your target reservoir? In using industrial sources. And really the only successful EOR using CO2 is actually a great distance away. The end user from its source, the CO2 is sourced in southern Colorado and New Mexico. And it's transmitted almost 500-600 miles down to the Permian Basin. If it were an industrial source, I don't know where you would get it from.
Right.
The same is true for water. So really, the first component is if you want to use an injectant, where is it? How are you going to get it to your reservoir? Two, what type of a reservoir do you have? Because it's not, they're heterogeneous. And whether you're in East Texas and you're shallow or in the Permian Basin or you're deep, your permeability and your porosity, is it a carbonate formation or is it a shale? There's not one solution
Right.
that solves all.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is you have to match the geology, the infrastructure, the economics, and then the source that is going to be injected into the well, and getting those things to line up, which gets me to this case that we can kind of talk about a little bit, because it would personify what we're discussing, and that is when Exxon bought Denbury, which was, like a $5 or $6 billion transaction, which is supposed to close at the end of this year. So Denbury was known for its enhanced oil recovery practices and capabilities. And then it also has, these carbon capture infrastructure assets. They have like 1,300 miles of CO2 pipeline. And the Exxon CEO said, well, we didn't buy Denbury for its EOR, enhanced oil recovery capabilities, but for its carbon capture potential. And then we could pivot to EOR if things don't line up. Can you talk a little bit? Because you're basically saying that you've got to line these things up. So what do you think they're saying about the priority of, CCS versus EOR and how they would stage that?
CO2 is a very different and very difficult substance to move. It's very small, despite the number of people that are entering the arena. It's a short list of people that know how. And I do believe that we're seeing more and more people every month come be honest in saying this: the lack of knowledge about moving CO2 in its dense phase is supercritical, which means maintaining its pressure and temperature, its flow rate upon injection. You really have a very small pool of people. And at the top of that list is Denbury, although all of their experience was obtained in EOR moving CO2 out of Jackson Dome. I do honestly believe that Exxon has purchased them specifically for carbon storage and not EOR because of that knowledge base. I don't see any activity that would evidence Exxon moving into an enhanced oil. So I actually believe that comment. I think they really are dedicated to moving emissions out of Harris County via the Houston Ship Channel and out into the Gulf of Mexico. And who better to get to do that than Denbury Resources? To the point that we had about secondary and tertiary recovery, that's also correct. It's not as easy as an objective. It's just, well, we're not going to run it into storage. We're going to run it into an enhanced oil recovery. There's management of CO2 so that it is effective in a CCS model is purely a matter of maintaining injection pressure, filling up your storage complex, maintaining all of the components of CO2 so that your EOR project is effective is a very different process. A lot of it's dependent upon the price of oil as well. You're not just going to be able to run a CO2 pipeline as a trunk and have feeder lines go off to individual EOR projects, although that is a theoretical idea that we've had, and we've seen a lot of other people with that same idea, because all of your different reservoirs are going to require completely different things. Some are going to be a huff and puff, which is where you inject CO2 for a short period of time and seal off the reservoir, let it take effect, become miscible with the oil, and then you open the well back up and it stimulates production, then you do it again. Some require water alternating with gas. Some don't have the permeability required. And so the fact that EOR sounds theoretically and conceptually like a really good use of carbon dioxide, and I do believe that it is, it's a much larger conversation and requires a lot more variables with very different odds of success than just a CCS project.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like, in fact, so we know that CCS projects have all these factors and timelines that have to line up that we've discussed. And it sounds like what you're saying is within the EOR space, it's even more complicated. And so it sounds like what you're saying, that the innovation of shale, horizontal drilling, all the, the extraction methods, all of it, that was a big innovation that could be scaled in a way. Whereas EOR, if you're thinking about, oh, is that shale 3.0 or whatever, it's not that. It is its own subset of issues. Like, it's not a highly scalable prospect, like shale tech, if you want to just call it that,
Right.
was. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. And you know, the attraction of carbon storage is that there's a static, to the extent that that economic model has evolved or continues to evolve, it will evolve at some point. You've got a static model. What I mean by that is, what people essentially are trying to do is take carbon dioxide as a waste product, build an infrastructure to inject it underground, and recoup a very valuable, theoretically valuable tax credit. Maybe require some front end capital from the federal government or private investment, but you're going to be recouping essentially $85 per metric ton forever.
Right.
With an EOR project, you're no longer disposing of a waste product, but you're selling a commodity, and that commodity price is variable. And this is why EOR is difficult, even when you're paying, whatever they're charging MCF out of the Cortez pipeline that's run by Kinder Morgan. You sign yourself up for a long-term contract, and oil goes from, there's a problem with the vitality of the oil price of barrel oil. And oil goes from $77 to $52 a barrel. Then your EOR project no longer becomes economical. You're not getting the valuable tax credit that you are for CCS. So essentially, from a business development standpoint, why would you sign up for that unknown variable? And I think that's probably Exxon's rationale is, yeah, it really sounds good. We have all this CO2. Why don't we just use it to stimulate oil and gas production?
Yeah.
That switch is not so easy to flip.
Yeah. And then that gets to, again, okay, so maybe you use that subsidy to work out your CCS play, but then there's also the issue of, will that subsidy stay? Is it sticky? Probably not. If we start, if there are other innovations, you know what I'm saying? So that's
I come to these questions with, I'm a perfect test case. Our first carbon capture project that we were hired to develop 15 years ago was an EOR project. And I became a huge fan of the possibilities because it was all on a whiteboard. When we started taking it to the reservoir engineers, and just of late, even with US carbon capture, the first exposure to good sound CO2 management came, and our two engineers, one of them had been a decade at Denbury, and silenced me like that. And it just basically said, here's all of the variables that you have to maintain to have an effective EOR project using carbon dioxide, which is why if you really want to go see a good one, other than the natural source CO2 that's pure and never ending, it seems, the unlimited supply, you really don't see a whole lot of successful. There's a couple of ethanol plants, even in the Panhandle, where it's been done for fertilizer. They just are very, very difficult to pull off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like in some respects, with we're wasting time and we're chasing our tails on some of this in some respects. And it's like, and that's the problem that I've discussed about if you're just looking at net zero, which is decarbonization, you're going to miss other things, which is exactly what you're describing, because maybe that's not the factor, right? Maybe that, and then you're going to miss what you could have done in the meantime that it would in fact probably helped you decarbonize to begin with,
I really think there's a path. I don't think you're going to see this embraced, but I think there's a path to further, to quicker decarbonization. Just to give you some insight into some of the discussions we've had internally at U.S. Carbon Capture, to flipping the tax credit. If you gave a larger tax credit for enhanced oil recovery, one, you're going to avail yourself of better proven geology. If you really want safe carbon storage, you need to put it in an oil reservoir that for the last 100 years has been proven, has a shale seal and anticline formation, and it's got porosity permeability. If it'll store hydrocarbons, it'll store anything else. Oh, and by the way, as a byproduct, if you're successful in managing it, you may even stimulate some additional revenue in the form of tertiary oil and gas production.
Right.
Elevated the tax credit for the oil and gas industry to use CO2 for EOR. You could deploy CCS 5 times faster than you are under a CCS, exclusively CCS regime.
Right. Because now it's like CCS for what?
Yeah.
Where are you putting it? You don't have, I completely see the end use and that the end use has value, which oil does. It's valuable commodity, fungible commodity.
Well, and it solves another larger problem, which I think the environmental groups and certainly the landowners and the general population, the question we get asked all the time is migration. Tell me about migration. If this is an untested saline reservoir deep underground, what else have you put in there? What else have you extracted? Tell me about your geological understanding of this formation.
Right.
And the best way to understand a formation is to look at past research in the forms of geological studies and well logs. And so nothing holds that more than a legacy oil field.
Right.
And if there's recoverable oil and gas left down there, we've already discussed it for the most part in the lower 48 there is, why not just choose this as your storage complex and move into decarbonization right now? If it's a successful EOR project, great. But if it's not, at least you're advancing carbon storage safely in a reservoir that will hold it.
Right. Yeah. You kill 3 birds with 1 stone, basically. Well, that's great. Wow. Sounds like there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of future policy to develop yet. So maybe we advance that a little bit today. So is there anything else that you think that we didn't touch on that within this conversation of EOR and tangentially CCS?
No, not really, but I think to button it up here at the end, and I've already forgotten resource efficiency.
Resource efficiency.
I mean, really, the most valuable piece of information we can talk about is not the fact that here are the different ways that secondary and tertiary recovery can be executed, but that's actually a component at all, that there is so much You hear discussions all the time about the exhaustion of hydrocarbons and the end of the petroleum age. Is there's more proven reserves now in the Western Hemisphere than there is in the East.
Mhm.
And with technological advances that may or may not come, including some that already exist, there's a phenomenal amount, excuse me, of recoverable oil still left,
Yeah,
certainly in the state of Texas, albeit the United States, that we have the ability to go through and extract without drilling and capitalizing new wells.
right.
At the same time, we have this component that we're trying to find a solution to pull out of our atmosphere that, if put into these very same reservoirs, will stimulate that production. How long do we stay away from matching these two things together?
Right, right. No, very good. So carbon capture to help get to the last drop of oil.
Yeah, I like it.
Um, yeah, to
We'll see.
resource efficiency to the last drop. That would be our tagline. Okay. Thanks again, Jonathan, for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Jennifer.